Okay, so back to what I was getting at. And this is the kind of thing that, like, I wish I could sit down with somebody and have this conversation because I'm the kind of person who, as I try to explain things, I need to bounce ideas off of people to work them out. And so this would be a lot easier if I could sit down and literally explain this to someone and they could ask me questions because it would help me process. But I'm doing my best. So the communication style thing I find really interesting because, as I mentioned before, we are, especially when it comes to business, and I think to a certain extent in schools, let's take the example of teachers being, new teachers being warned about cultural difference, such as eye contact. Look me in the eye so that I know you're listening to me. But in some cultures, that is a form of disrespect. In some cultures, for a young male to look a woman in the eye is very offensive. And seen as very inappropriate. So that's something that we need to be aware of, is different communication styles. But I think Americans are very direct in that way, which is really interesting because at the same time, our attitude towards conflict is also very different than a lot of other places I've seen. I've lived in countries where you just yell at each other and that's it, it's done. And in America, if you see two people screaming at each other in the street, you assume, wow, those people are, need counseling or have anger issues or, must be really, really upset. But I've been other places where, you hash it out, it's done. One example is a friend of mine who told me a story about how a man disrespected his wife. And in his culture, he would have just gone to that man's house, knocked on his door, and said, listen, dude, not cool. I'm really unhappy with you. You treated my wife with disrespect. I want to talk to you about it. I'm not okay with it. I need to hear why. I need an explanation. They'd hash it out. They'd hug it out. It'd be done. And in that context, in the Western world, then, it was the husband had to understand that he can't go do that. You can't, in the Western world, you can't just go do that. But on the flip side, say in business, we would have no problem approaching somebody that we don't know or we don't have a relationship with, and presenting something to them or coming to them or something like that. Whereas in other cultures, relationships are everything, and if you don't have a relationship with somebody in business, you have no business talking with them. So I know that this is focused on communication styles, but I think that conflict resolution and conflict is a big part of this. And conflict in schools is a big part of this, because you may see a student who deals with things a certain way, and that to you, that may spell one thing without understanding their cultural context. So let's go back to Americans. We're fairly direct. We're very individualist. We know that. Non-verbal communication and gestures, there's a high value placed on that. Active listening, make eye contact, nod, respond. In another culture, it may be putting your head down like this is you actively listening. So understanding that's really important. Facial expressions, things like that. Eye contact, I think, is a really big one, and that's something that I've encountered a lot. But that goes into conflict, because when you talk about communication styles, basically you're talking about the way people engage, and conflict is bound to arise. And, what might be seen as passive-aggressive is really just the way that, somebody deals with something culturally, versus straight up, let's just hash it out and it's done and it's over, and then we can move on, which personally I prefer. I prefer cultures that just say just say it. And I encountered that actually this summer a lot, trying to explain that to my husband, who experienced the US for the first time, and how he'd think everything was fine, and I would have to stop and say, listen, no, that person was upset. And he's like, well, but they seemed fine. And I'm like, well, that's because that's what Americans do. We just don't say it. We just smile and nod to save face, and we don't just hash it out right then and there. And if you start hashing it out right then and there, it's seen as very socially unacceptable. So that sort of dichotomy, I suppose, between directness versus conflict avoidance is really interesting. So that's what I have to say about those things. I think that, if I were to sit down with somebody, I love having these kind of conversations with people. And the more and more I travel and the more I learn, I think that both Lewis and Hofstede have really, really accurate, wonderful models of all these things, of individualism, of communication. And I think it's important to discuss your own culture because it helps you to understand better the way that you respond to situations and the way that you view others when you see things that surprise you and you don't understand them. To stop for a second and go, okay, well, I wouldn't yell and scream at that person. Why is this person yelling and screaming? Do they have an anger issue, or is this cultural? And looking at that is something that I think that, again, I think as I mentioned in one of my other assignments, that I think the world might be a much better place if all of us talked about this kind of stuff more, because there's a reason why there's an entire there's dimensions and there's an entire spread of different contexts and things like that. So, thanks.